Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Lamont, you may continue. Ms. LaViolette, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
Good morning, Ms. LaViolette.
Good morning, Ms. Wallen.
I want to ask you a question about the continuum that we talked about 2 days ago.
Yes.
Okay? And is that a continuum, do you use that exclusively when you're trying to decide or make decisions about the type of relationship people are in, whether or not it's abusive or not?
No, I don't. The continuum for me was just sort of a framework, kind of a way of thinking. And other people use it, I use it. But it's sort of something that's in my head. But I've read, there are a lot of people in the field who've done some really wonderful work. Jackie Campbell, Alan Rosenbaum, Bob Geffner, Michael Johnson, Dan Sonkin, and I've read their work, and I've used different things that they've written as well. And I meet regularly with people who do the work that I do, both with survivors and with perpetrators. And so I think I get the best from everybody, because I get the things that are written in the research, but I also get to talk with the people that do the hands-on work and really, for me, make it alive.
Okay, so when you're assessing relationships, do they necessarily fit nicely and neatly into one of those columns that we looked at?
No, they absolutely don't. I don't think anybody fits nicely into a column. I think that what you look at is just sort of a range of behaviors, and what you're trying to do with that is to, for me, I use it to think about what are some of the best interventions maybe that I could be using to work with somebody. And so I'm looking at different things that people do that might fit in different parts of the continuum and ways that might be more effective in assessing, and then coming up with ways to intervene.
All right. So in your work, in speaking with all these women that you have, and the perpetrators as well over the years, have you ever noticed whether or not survivors or victims have faced additional scrutiny based on the way social media seems to portray them?
Absolutely.
Tell us why.
Well, if you look at the media portrayals of domestic violence, and I think particularly of 3 movies and then one that just came out this summer, but The Burning Bed, I think, was the first one that was really big, and Farrah Fawcett played the lead in that, and then there was Sleeping with the Enemy, and Julia Roberts played the lead in that, and then you had Enough that starred Jennifer Lopez, and now you've got one that came out this summer with Julianne Hough. And in each of those portrayals, what you see is a very popular female actress that's usually beloved by many people, and she's pure as the driven snow, and she's never done anything wrong, and she's portrayed as a saint, basically, on the screen. And then what you have, and I think it's kind of a subtle manipulation of the way we think, you have lesser-known male actors who become the perpetrator on these films. And what winds up happening is you see these lesser-known male perpetrators, and they're actually very one-dimensional, and they're purely evil. They're not people that anybody would want to be with, and I actually don't think they would have partners if they acted that way all the time. So we have this very defined, sort of black and white category, pure good and pure evil, and anybody doesn't fit into that. I mean, I don't think I do. I don't think most people I know do. And so what we do is we have this standard in our heads, and I think when most people think perpetrator, they think somebody in one of those films. And I have yet to meet that person in 34 years. And
let me ask you this, and all the men that you have in your groups and all the time that you've worked with the men, is that what you're saying? You have yet to meet someone who is so purely evil like we see in the movies?
Yes.
Okay, and what about the women?
And I've yet to meet the woman who has no flaws. And I think sometimes we judge, and I think we tend to judge. My experience has been, when I did probation training, I would take a formerly battered woman and a recovering perpetrator out to speak to the probation officers because I thought it would be a really good thing to be able to listen to people who'd been through it speak. And there was almost always more judgment for the survivor than there was for the perpetrator.
Let me ask you this. What do you mean by judgment?
That the probation department, and these were other places that I took people to, and it wasn't certainly just probation, but it was the view that why didn't she leave sooner? But if she left and the perpetrator looked like they were going to change, why didn't she go back? Why didn't she forgive him? Why, even if they'd been back and forth a few times? So there was that look, whereas the perpetrator that spoke was seen as, really trying to get better and change. And so there was a lot of encouragement for that. But the survivor was judged more harshly.
All right. And so based on these stereotypes, I guess, could you characterize them as stereotypes?
I would say that, sure.
And so based on these stereotypes that we see in the media, have you seen problems then with people in general being able to empathize with the survivor, the victim?
Objection, relevance.
Approach.
You were just telling us an example of when you spoke to, I think it was probation officers, and you brought a survivor and a recovering perpetrator.
Yes,
And when you spoke to, and probation officers, are those people who work in the judicial system?
yes, they are people who work in the judicial system.
And so, and those probation officers, so they would see typically perpetrators. They would be actually working with these people who are perpetrators. Is that right? They would be working with these people, perpetrators, right?
Yes, they would.
And when you spoke with this probation group, when you were talking with them, you were just telling us, did you notice that they judged the survivor more harshly than the perpetrator?
Yes.
And have you given other talks to groups where you've noticed this different judgment, basically harsher judgment to the survivor versus the perpetrator?
Objection, recommendation, groups.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, I have. I've spoken to many different groups representing, social interests, business interests, social service interests, and there have been several documentaries, or a number of documentaries.
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Are you aware of any documentaries that have been done with regard to this issue?
Numerous documentaries done on this issue, and it's one of the things survivors have said that
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
What do survivors say?
Just in relevance.
Overruled.
survivors feel judged. Survivors have spoken about not being able to tell people, and then when they finally did tell somebody, that people wondered what they had done to provoke it, or why they had stayed for as long as they did, or if there were children involved, the impact on their children. So there was a lot that they felt of judgment coming at them around this issue.
All right. And is this something in your own practice have you seen?
Yes, I have.
Okay. I want to switch things over. I want to talk about what you've done specific to this case, for Miss Arias, okay?
Yes.
When you were initially retained, did you review different items?
I did. I was given, not a lot, but I was given paperwork representing a variety of areas, and I was sent a box of paperwork to review and look over about the case.
All right. And after that was just a limited amount of paperwork, is that what she said?
Yes.
Objection, leading. Lack of foundation, limited amount.
Sustained.
Judge, she just said limited amount.
So follow up.
Okay. So did you end up getting more information later?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So in the beginning, when you first got some information, was it limited?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And so when you were reviewing this information, did you immediately take the case?
No, I did not.
Did you go and speak with Miss Arias first?
I did. I flew over and I went to jail, and I spent 8 hours in jail with Miss Arias the first day, and between 6 and 7 hours in jail with her the second day.
All right. And after speaking with her for 2 days, did you decide to accept the case?
I decided that I would accept the case because I had questions.
Objection, relevance. Lack of foundation.
Goes to credibility.
Approach. You may continue.
So Ms. LaViolette, after you spoke with Jodi, did you decide to accept the case then?
Yes, I did.
All right. And after accepting the case, and did you get more additional information then also?
Then after I accepted the case and agreed to pursue the case and look at this information, I was sent an additional plethora of information.
All right, let's talk about that plethora of information. What is it that you have reviewed?
I've reviewed 7 hours of unedited footage that was done by CBS 48 Hours and the edited version. I have reviewed journals that were written by Miss Arias from the time that she was with Mr. Alexander until his death. I reviewed IM instant messages, text messages, emails from Miss Arias, Mr. Alexander, Sky and Chris Hughes, emails, instant messages, and text messages from Mr. Alexander to numerous women. I reviewed collateral interviews that were done before I came on the case. There were approximately, I think, around 20 collateral interviews that were done with Miss Arias's family and extended family, prior boyfriends, employers, a couple of friends. I spent approximately 44 hours in jail interviewing Miss Arias. I went over Dr. Samuel's report. I went over Dr. DeMarte's report. I saw the crime scene and autopsy photos. I saw other photos that were taken on the day of the homicide, and some family photos as well.
Okay. And you said you spent about 44 hours speaking with Jodi?
Yes, I did.
And during that time, you don't do any scientific testing with her, do you?
No, I'm not an expert on testing.
Okay. So that time that you spent with Jodi, is that just speaking with her and talking to her?
It's speaking with her, it's talking with her, it's trying to get information that I need when I'm reading this documentation. Maybe I need clarification on some things. But it's also creating enough of a connection that we're able to talk with each other and she's willing to share information with me.
And is that something that you have to typically do with people when you're just beginning to speak with them? Do you have to create a connection?
Absolutely. I have to do that with anybody I work with, whether I'm working in court cases or whether I'm doing counseling, whether I'm doing public speaking, whatever that is. You have to create a rapport to have people be able to talk to you and feel comfortable enough to give you information that you're looking for. And when you're asking people very personal questions, they have to feel comfortable enough with you to answer those questions.
Do you do the same thing when you're talking to men, perpetrators in your men's group? Do you create a rapport with them as well?
Yes, I do. And that was seen as collusion.
And when you create a rapport with the men in your men's group, is that so you can ultimately get the information from them?
It's so not only so I can get the information from them, it's so they feel comfortable enough to work with me. It's so that they feel that they can, that they trust me, that I believe that they can change if they make an effort, that they trust me, that if I give them some information and ask them to try something, that they might be willing to try it. Yeah.
Okay. And when you create a rapport with someone, whether it be somebody from your men's group or whether it be Jodi, does that mean that you like them necessarily?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by like. What do you mean by like them? I mean, I do like the people I work with. I don't know. I like people. I mean, people, I've always been interested in people. I find people ultimately interesting, and I think that very few people are unlikable. So I like people, and I'm willing, so I sort of automatically kind of do that, but I'm not sure what you mean by like.
Well, let me ask you this. When you like these people and you create a rapport with them, does that mean that in some way that it might cloud your judgment about the situation that you're assessing?
No, I don't think it clouds my judgment. I think it allows me to actually see more, because people will tend to feel more comfortable with you and tell you more and maybe be more relaxed and willing to show you who they are a little bit.
Okay. And would you say that goes with Jodi as well when you spoke with her?
I think so.
Did you have any issues with feeling that because you spent this time with her, that somehow your judgment about what she's telling you or about what you reviewed clouded your judgment in any way?
No, I don't. What I do in any case,
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
What do you do in any case?
Objection to relevance, that's this one.
As to the phrasing of the question sustained.
How do you work your cases so that you make sure your judgment isn't clouded?
I actually investigate any cases I work on, whether they're family law cases, criminal cases, and civil cases. I spend a lot of time investigating them because I don't want to go on the stand and testify about something that I don't believe.
All right. With you know what? Let me ask you this: Did you ever give Jodi any magazines or books?
I did. I ordered a subscription to a magazine called Ode for Miss Arias, and I also sent 4 books for Miss Arias to read.
All right. And were these? What was the purpose of that?
I've done that for other people in jail because
Objection to relevance.
Sustained.
Judge, may we approach?
You may continue.
Ms. Violet, what, with regard to Jodi sending her items, why did you do that?
I did that because I think jail is a pretty boring place, and that people who are in jail and getting ready for trial, it's, from my perspective, not a bad thing for them to have materials that are either educational, and primarily educational or enjoyable for them to read. So I have done that in other cases. And I usually tailor that to whoever that is I'm talking to. And I've had people, by the way, who don't know me.
Sustained.
What have you had? Have you done this in other cases?
I've done this in other cases.
Okay. And because of that, does that somehow help when you're doing your evaluations, your assessments?
Well, I'm not thinking of it in terms of helping me.
Okay.
I haven't ever thought of it in terms of helping me, although
Let me ask you this then. Why do you do it
I do
in
it.
other cases?
Why do I do it in other cases? Because
Objection to relevance.
Sustained.
Ms. LaViolette, you just talked about how you did this for Jodi, right?
yes,
All right. And is this something that you've only done for Jodi, or do you do this in other cases?
I do this in other cases.
Okay. And is this something that has been consistent for you?
It has been something that's consistent for me.
And do you see any issues? Are there any rules against you doing this?
No, I ask the procedure if someone's in jail. I ask the procedure for sending materials, and I do that according to whatever rules are at that particular facility.
Oh, the rules for sending the items.
Yes,
Okay. With regard to your license as a therapist, is there any issues with sending a person books or magazines?
no, there's no, it's not an ethical boundary.
All right. And have
Unless you were trying to get something from somebody, which I'm not.
Okay. All right. All right. So let's see. So let's talk about. Let's talk a little bit about what you've learned about Jodi. Okay.
All right.
And I want to specifically talk about what you learned about her family of origin, where she came from, where she grew up. Okay?
Okay.
Not specifically where, because I want to be specific. But speaking of the family that she grew up with, what do you know about her family with whom she grew up?
Objection, lack of foundation source.
Did she already discussed everything that she's reviewed?
Approach, please.
May continue.
Ms. Violet, I know that we already discussed the numerous items that you've reviewed, but in those numerous items that you talked about, did you tell us how you have listened to or read interviews from Jodi's family members?
Yes, I have.
All right. And in doing so, and in speaking with Jodi, right?
Yes.
And in doing so, did you learn about her family of origin, the family with whom she grew up?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so let's talk about that, okay?
All right.
All right. So what do you know about, let's talk about her mom and dad. What do you know about their relationship?
I read collateral data from Jodi's grandparents and Jodi's mother's sisters, a cousin, I believe, a half-sister, or a cousin, and her brothers and her sister. And I learned that in Jodi's family there was a certain amount of physical discipline, some which I would consider went over the line, and some that didn't.
What are you speaking? Can you tell us specifically what you're talking about?
Well, probably not. I'm not sure at that time, but when you leave welts on a child, and that was information I was given, that they were hit with spoons, that her brother Carl feels that he's very impatient, and that was something, and too strict and too harsh, which was sort of confirmed by his fiance at the time that I read it, with their own children, and that he considered he had gotten that from his father. That between Jodi's mother and father, that Jodi's father was controlling and manipulative and made derogatory statements if her mother gained weight or...
Let me stop you there. You said controlling and manipulative. Let's talk about controlling. In what ways did you read about Jodi's father being controlling?
That he was jealous and didn't want her to spend time with her family members, particularly her sisters.
Didn't want who?
Didn't want Jodi's mother to spend time with the sisters, that he's on dialysis and there's a schedule for going to the hospital, and that he would sometimes manipulate and wait until the last minute so that she couldn't go, for instance, to hear Jodi sing the national anthem when she went to sing the national anthem, to attend her I believe her mother's funeral or grandmother's funeral. And it was more that kind of thing, more sort of subtle but controlling behavior, that he was jealous. They said that. And with Jodi, there were times that he was, I think, sort of inappropriate, at least in my experience,
And what do you mean by that?
Well, when Jodi was in second, third grade, she told her dad that she had a crush on a little boy, and they drove by the park, and her dad rolled the window down and screamed at the little boy, you want my daughter? I'm going to go home and get my toy, which was a gun. That he would talk about Jodi's body. He would talk about her boobs being too small, that her friend had a smaller booty than she did. So I think sort of sexually inappropriate comments to your daughter. That's the way I would see it.
Okay.
And that just kind of things like hanging a picture of Jodi's mother up when she was thinner, when she had gained weight. These sort of less overt, more covert kinds of statements about you're too heavy.
Okay. And is this something that, well, let me ask you this. Are Jodi's parents still married today?
Jodi's parents are still married.
And so is this something that Jodi would have grown up with? Did she see these things? Did she tell you that she saw these things?
Yes, she told me that she saw those things.
All right. And what is it that she learns from watching this type of family dynamic with a father, with these issues with the father?
Well, over time when we talked, she said, I learned about loyalty. I learned about, but the other thing that I think I learned was, and it was a while before she said this, she said, I think I must have learned about giving up the things I want for somebody I love.
Is that how she saw her mother with her father?
Yes.
And the loyalty aspect, her mother staying with her father?
That you stay in a relationship, whether it's what you want it to be or not.
Okay.
By the way, a lesson that many...
What's the lesson?
A lesson that many survivors have talked about is that they saw things about staying through thick and thin, and even when they didn't like what was happening, and that's what they did.
What?
They remained in a relationship that was abusive because the lessons they got growing up were that you stay in a relationship and you do everything you can to make it work.
All right. And is that one of the issues that you see with the women that you work with of why they tend to stay? One of the reasons why they stay?
It's one of the issues, certainly.
Okay.
For many of them, not all of them.
Right. Does it matter if a child like Jodi sees this versus hears something? Are actions stronger or words stronger?
Well, I think there's an old saying that actions speak louder than words, and there are a number of commercials out now that will, on drugs, that show a parent smoking dope and then going in and going after their child and said, I told you not to do that. And the old adage, do what I say, not what I do, doesn't tend to work. We tend to learn so much more by observation. We learn how to be who we are by observing people that we respect or people that have power in our lives while we're growing up by observing how they behave.
All right, and did Jodi talk to you about dealing, because of the issues between her parents, does she have issues with her mother?
She does have issues with her mother. And I read some things. Her grandparents said that they believe that Jodi is angry at her mother and that she's angry at her mother because Jodi's mother didn't protect her from her father and that her father said mean things to her. And there weren't details about what those mean things were, but that was what the grandparents said. So that was one thing. The other thing that I read was that once Jodi's little sister and brother were born, and there's an 11-year difference between Jodi and her younger sister, and about 12 or 13, Jodi and her younger brother, that Jodi and Carl, the two older kids, became invisible, basically, and were just sort of left on their own. at a time in adolescence when I think it's kind of difficult, when kids need a lot of guidance.
All right. All right, I want to talk to you now specifically about the relationship between Jodi and Travis, all right?
Yes.
And at the time of the relationship beginning, where was Jodi as far as her relationship status? What was going on with her?
Jodi had been in a 4-year relationship, and that was drawing to a close. It hadn't ended, but it was drawing to a close. And it was a relationship where she wanted to get married and wanted to have children, and that was sort of what she was looking at. When she was vulnerable. I think when you come out of a long-term relationship, for most people, they're fairly vulnerable at that point. And so she was in a vulnerable place when she met Mr. Alexander.
All right. And what do you know about when she met Mr. Alexander?
Well, they met at a PPL meeting, prepaid legal sort of conference in Las Vegas. And conferences are pretty exciting places to be anyway. And there's usually a lot of energy at a conference. People get excited. And so she was at this conference in a sort of fun location. And she was with friends, and Mr. Alexander came up to her and said, "Hi, I'm Travis," and introduced himself and pursued her.
Okay. Did she, this was over a long weekend, right?
Yes.
And so did they end up spending time together? This is where they first met, is that right?
Yes.
And so they end up spending time together then?
They did spend time together. He invited her to the executive director's banquet, which was a pretty prestigious event. It was an event for people who were sort of the high rollers in PPL. And Jodi initially said that she couldn't go and she didn't have anything to wear. And Mr. Alexander borrowed a dress for her from Sky Hughes, who was, her husband was one of the executives in prepaid legal. And so Jodi went to that banquet, which was pretty important because she was introduced to important people. She had a good time. And then Mr. Alexander had tickets to seating that was preferred seating for this conference. And so he invited Miss Arias to sit in this preferred seating. And the two of them were able to, finish the conference seated in this really nice area.
You mean that she got to sit down in special seats up close?
Yes, she did.
Okay, and she got to sit in these seats because who gave them to her?
Because Mr. Alexander had those tickets and invited her to sit with him.
All right. Would she have been able to sit there if it weren't for Mr. Alexander inviting her?
No, she wouldn't have.
All right. What else do you know about that particular weekend between the two of them?
Just that he pursued her and that it was pretty exciting. And I believe that was when he told her that he was Mormon, and she was very impressed with the family values of the Mormon faith.
All right. Was that something regarding family values? Was that something that she was looking for with regard to her current status, her current relationship?
Yes, I think she was very disappointed that she wasn't married and didn't have children. She wanted to marry and have children, and so the family values aspect was very important to her.
All right. So what about this weekend? If we're talking about a progression of a relationship, and if you're assessing this relationship, what about this weekend that they first met would be important to someone like you?
Well, what's important to me is that there's such a power differential between the two of them. When someone has power, when someone is a high roller, when someone is prestigious in their faith, when someone courts you and woos you and pulls you into a situation, there's a power difference. Now, would I look at that in every relationship? I do, actually. When I'm assessing in couples counseling, I look for power differences to see how evenly this couple is balanced with each other.
All right. And with just looking at this weekend alone, does it mean necessarily that the relationship was abusive?
No, No, not at all. In fact, at the beginning of a relationship, whether it's abusive or not abusive, they pretty much look the same. In a lot of cases, you know, they might not look any different at all.
Okay. All right. And then what happens when she goes home, when she leaves the seminar with her relationship with Mr. Brewer?
With Mr. Brewer,
Yes.
she ends her relationship with Mr. Brewer within about a week after she comes back from that convention and conference, and she ends her relationship with him.
All right. And does Mr. Alexander, is he pursuing her?
Yes, he's calling her.
Okay. And by calling her, is he inviting her anywhere? What is he doing?
Well, he invites her over to Sky and Chris Hughes's house,
All right.
and she goes.
Okay. And time frame. Let's talk time frame. When not exact, but when after the conference is she going to the Hughes's house?
It's about a week and a half after the conference that she goes to Chris and Sky Hughes' house and meets Mr. Alexander there.
All right. And is this something that she has to drive to? Are they in the same city or different cities?
Mr. Alexander, you mean?
The Hugheses.
The Hughes live in Palm Desert, and I think that's where Miss Arias lives as well. She lives over in Palm.
All right. Do they? Well, are you not
Yeah.
sure?
No.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. I know she lives close to there, but
Okay.
she's not
And
that
was-
far away.
Okay. And was Mr. Alexander in Mesa at the time, living in Mesa, Arizona?
Right.
Okay. So did they meet at the Hughes' house?
They met at the Hughes' house.
All right. And what do you know about that weekend?
During that weekend, when Mr. Alexander arrives at the Hughes' house, there's a period of time where he doesn't pay any attention to Miss Arias and rarely, doesn't talk to her. And then after a time, he sort of acknowledges her, and they spend the rest of the evening and they're watching videos, I think, that sort of thing. And then when they go to bed, when they go up to bed, after everybody's in bed, Mr. Alexander sneaks into Miss Arias' room and starts to kiss her. She says that she has felt very uncomfortable, but she also is very attracted to him and doesn't want him to lose interest in her. And he begins to take her clothes off, which he does, and performs oral sex. And so they have oral sex.
All right. And at this point in time, she's certainly not of the Mormon faith, right? At this point?
She's not Mormon, no.
Okay. And did she speak to you about her being uncomfortable with that type of sex?
She said she was uncomfortable because she thought it was too fast, too soon, but she didn't exactly know how to stop it.
All right. And she ultimately went through with it, obviously, right?
She did. She did go through with it.
The fact that she was uncomfortable with the too fast, too soon, but then goes through with it, is that important to you?
Well, the way it would be important to me is to look at it in a broader context. But certainly, I think one of the things that happens is that for many young women, it is very difficult to say no, especially if they're attracted to someone.
Other folks.
Sustained.
With regard to your expertise, do you speak to other women about these types of situations?
Yes, I have.
And what do you learn from these other women?
That when they feel pressured, they're not sure how to stand up for themselves. Now, this certainly isn't every woman. I'm not trying to say that at all. But when you're a more vulnerable woman, when you're not as a real assertive woman, and maybe when your boundaries aren't as good, you are much more likely. And when people are vulnerable, their boundaries tend not to be as good. Then saying no can be a more difficult thing.
All right. You said a couple of things in there. Vulnerable and boundaries. Does this incident tell you anything about what Jodi might have been going through at this time with regard to her vulnerability or setting boundaries?
It speaks to both of those things, that she was vulnerable, which was about coming out of that relationship, that she wanted stability, which she talked about, that she met someone who appeared to be very stable, who was of a faith that really supported and appreciated family, and that she was probably not real strong with her boundaries or ability to say no. And some people are better at that than others.
Okay. After that night, do they go to church the next morning?
They do.
And does Mr. Alexander do anything at church with regard to taking a sacrament?
He does. He takes the sacrament.
And at that point in time, was that, in speaking with Jodi, was that important to Jodi at that point in time?
I don't believe so, because I don't think she hadn't read the Book of Mormon yet. She didn't know the parameters of the Mormon faith, so I would think it would not be as significant to her at that time.
All right. After that weekend at the Hughes, did they leave separately? Did Miss Arias leave separately?
Yes,
And did she go back to her house?
I believe she went back to her house.
At some point, I guess, right?
Yes.
When did she see Mr. Alexander again?
I think it was just a few days later, and
And when she saw Mr. Alexander, what happened?
she met Mr. Alexander at a Starbucks, and he gave her the Book of Mormon at that time and challenged her to read it.
Let me ask you this, Miss LaViolette. Time-wise, she had just met him how long ago?
We're looking within a 2-week period, I believe, at this point.
Okay, so within a 2-week period, they've had oral sex, is that right?
Yes,
And then he is stopping by the Starbucks. Is that where she lives?
yes,
Okay, so he's meeting her in her town and giving her the Book of Mormon?
yes.
All right. And what does he do after he gives her the Book of Mormon? You said he challenges her?
He challenges her to read the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
And then he tells her that he's horny, and they have oral sex. She performs oral sex on him
Where does this happen?
in a parking lot.
In a car?
Yeah, oh, yes, in a car in a parking lot.
Okay. And after she performs or gives him oral sex, does he leave?
He does. He gets in his car and he leaves.
All right. With regard to this all happening within a 2-week span of them first meeting, does that speak to her boundaries?
Well, to me it does.
Okay. Tell me what it means to
But
you.
I might be comparing my boundaries to her boundaries.
Okay, well, as an expert then, with regard to assessing relationships, does it speak to what Jodi might have been going through at that point?
Well, yes, because of the vulnerability coming out of the 4-year relationship and because of the other things that I've talked about, I believe that Miss Arias, and because of her family history, that her boundaries were probably a little more fluid than some other people's boundaries at that point.
All right. And after this period of time, were Mormon missionaries ever sent to her house?
Yes, Mr. Alexander sent Mormon missionaries to her house, and it was before Mr. Brewer left, so he observed that bishops came to her home and they had Bible studies and talked about the Mormon faith.
All right. And who sent those missionaries?
Mr. Alexander.
And do you know how often they came?
No, I don't.
Okay. The next time, I want to talk to you about the time that they spent in Ehrenberg.
All right.
Okay. What do you know about Ehrenberg?
Ehrenberg.
About the meeting in Ehrenberg, not the town itself.
Okay. Ehrenberg occurred about a month after they met. And in Ehrenberg, they had planned a meeting, get together, because they lived basically, they lived in 2 separate states. So they planned to meet in Ehrenberg, and from Miss Arias's perception, this was going to be a romantic weekend and a time to get together and spend time with each other. What she talks about with Ehrenberg is that they got there, and it was all about sex, and it was somewhat impersonal. Mr. Alexander was distant, and that the only time that he was really affectionate with her, and in a non-affectionate kind of way, was when they walked out into a parking lot and some of the truck drivers sort of looked at her and were doing a body scan, I guess, and Mr. Alexander slapped her on the fanny and in a sort of possessive way. And that was the extent of their time, that most of it was distant, it was sexual, it was not what she wanted. Once again, she went along with it, but she was not happy, it was not what she wanted.
Okay. But she stayed, you said.
She did.
All right. And you said that some of the truckers, was this a motel at a truck stop?
Yes, it was.
Afterwards, do they go their own separate ways?
I believe they do.
All right. And what happens afterwards that's important to you?
Well, he doesn't call her for a few days.
Okay.
And she starts to wonder if she's been used. She starts to wonder if he cares about her. And then he calls her, and she feels good because she's been called. It's sort of affirmed that he is thinking about her, he cares about her. And there's that bonding that occurs when you have that doubt, when you start to doubt whether somebody really cares about you. And that can happen in any dating situation, but particularly when there's been all this sexual intimacy, the fact that somebody doesn't call can really, in a psychological way, frighten somebody or make them apprehensive and make them self-doubting.
All right. And so is that what Jodi was doing?
Yes.
Did she say she felt stupid?
She said she felt stupid.
All right. And so then after Mr. Alexander calls her, what happens to those perceptions, her feeling of stupidity or feeling like being used? Does all that go away?
It does go away because she's got confirmation that he's thinking about her. She's got confirmation that he cares, in effect.
All right. And so what for you in assessing relationships does this mean? Does this speak to hopefulness at all?
It speaks to hopefulness. It speaks to reinforcement, having a reward that things are okay, and reward is significant to people, and hope is significant to people. So the belief that this relationship is meaningful and maybe has a way to go and has a future.
All right. And when she's doubting herself and feeling like she did something dumb because she was used, does that speak to self-blame?
It speaks to self-blame. It speaks to self-doubt as well.
Okay. All right. Okay. Is it important whether or not, because they're engaging in these sexual activities, is it important whether or not there's a connection during these sexual activities?
It is important. I think it's important to anyone to have connection in their sexual activities. And so it is important. And sexuality is a very connecting thing. It's a very powerful, way to connect. And there's a lot of emotion. And I think there's nakedness both in your body, but also if you're connected, there's that nakedness that you feel because you're emotionally connected with each other.
All right. And did she talk about feeling any connection that weekend?
No, she didn't feel connected. She felt sort of dismissed.
Okay. All right. We know that at some point she was baptized into the Mormon faith, right?
Yes.
And was that in November of 2006?
Yes, I believe it was.
Okay. And by the way, Ehrenberg, was that in October of 2006?
Yes, it was.
You said about a month after she met him?
Yes.
Okay. And so within 2 months after meeting Mr. Alexander, who baptized her?
Mr. Alexander.
All right. And at the baptism, did she speak to you about the importance for her of the baptism?
Well, the baptism, first of all, baptism is incredibly important to people who are baptized because it has a tremendous...
Do you have any knowledge with regard to Jodi being baptized, and was it important to her?
Jodi's baptism, Miss Arias' baptism, was very important to her. It was spiritually significant for her, and it was incredibly significant that Mr. Alexander was doing the baptism as well.
Why was that significant?
Because she asked him to do it because they were sharing a spiritual experience that has great importance in the Mormon faith, and because it demonstrates a connection between the two people.
All right. How did she look at him at this point, as far as in a religious manner? How did she perceive him to be?
Well, when you've been given the Book of Mormon by someone who is I believe it's called an endowed priesthood, I'm not sure, but he's in the priesthood of the Mormon Church, so he's seen as a spiritual mentor and actually a spiritual guide. She called him a spiritual guide, that he was the person that would allow her to understand the Mormon faith and to become more active in the Mormon faith. So I think he was her spiritual mentor, which is tremendous, you know.
Judge, may we take a break, please? May I approach?
Yes, please approach. Take a 5-minute recess, only 5 minutes. So please remember the admonition and be ready to come back in the courtroom in 5 minutes. Counsel, approach, please.